Modern classics, picked up this book from the library, The Outsider by Albert Camus. It is translated by Joseph Laredo, and Guardian says it's a compelling, dreamlike fable. The story of a beach murder, one of the century's classic novels, blood and sand, says J.G. Bullock. So here on this page, the first page, Albert Camus, something about Albert Camus. He was born in Algeria in 1913. His childhood was poor, although not unhappy. He studied philosophy at the University of Algiers and became a journalist as well as organizing the Theatre de l'Equipe, a young avant-garde dramatic group. So as you see, you can read it. Then after the occupation of France by Germans in 1941, Camus was a member of the resistance. He contributed to the underground newspaper Combat, which he had helped to found. And after the war, he devoted himself to writing and established an international reputation. I wrote many books. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957. He was killed in a road accident in 1960. His last novel, The First Man, unfinished at the time of his death, appeared for the first time in 1994, an instant bestseller. And much of Camus's work is available in Penguin. In the afterword, Albert Camus writes on page 118 that a long time ago I summed up The Outsider in a sentence which I realize is extremely paradoxical. In our society, any man who doesn't cry at his mother's funeral is liable to be condemned to death. I simply meant that the hero of the book is condemned because he doesn't play the game. In a sense, he's an outsider to the society in which he lives, wandering on the fringe, on the outskirts of life, solitary and sensual. He writes, so for me, Saul, that is the protagonist, is not a reject, but a poor and naked man in love with a sun which leaves no shadows. Far from lacking all sensibility, he is driven by a tenacious and therefore profound passion, the passion for an absolute and for truth. This truth is as yet a negative one, a truth born of living and feeling, but without which no triumph over the self or over the world will ever be possible. He writes, so one wouldn't be far wrong in seeing The Outsider as a story of a man who, without any heroic pretensions, agrees to die for the truth. And you should know what it is. You've got to read this. So here I read some musings that go on in the protagonist's mind when he's as a convict, when he's in the jail. So here's what he's thinking. I could see that what was wrong with the guillotine was that you had no chance at all, absolutely none. In fact, it had been decided once and for all that the patient would die. It was classified fact, a firmly fixed arrangement, a definite agreement that there was no question of going back on. In the unlikely event of something going wrong, they just started again. Consequently, the annoying thing was that the condemned man had to hope that the machine worked properly. I say this is what's wrong with the system. That's true in a way, but in another way, I had to admit that it also possessed the whole secret of good organization. After all, the condemned man was obliged to lend moral support. It was in his interest that everything should go off without a hitch. He further writes that I was also made to realize that up until then I had mistaken ideas about these things. I've always thought, I don't know why, that to get to the guillotine you had to climb onto a scaffold up some steps. I think it was because of the 1789 revolution. I mean, because of everything I had been shown or taught about these things. But one morning I remembered seeing a photograph which had appeared in the papers at the time of the famous execution. In actual fact, the machine stood flat on the ground, as ordinary as anything, and it was much narrower than I thought. It was funny that it hadn't occurred to me before. The machine in this picture had struck me because it looked so immaculate and gleaming, like a precision instrument. You always get exaggerated ideas of things you know nothing about. I was made to realize, on the contrary, everything was quite simple. So the machine is on the same level as the man who's walking towards it. He goes up to it just as you would go to meet another person. That was annoying too. Climbing up into the sky to mount the scaffold was something the imagination could hang on to. Whereas, once again, the mechanism demolished everything. They killed you discreetly and rather shamefacedly, but extremely accurately. So this is his musings. I found pretty gross, but yes. Further on, I'll read something out from what he feels when he looks at the skies from the skylight in his prison cell. So I'm reading that there are two other things I was always thinking about: the dawn and my appeal. I'd try to be rational though and not think about them anymore. I'd stretch out and look at the sky and force myself to take an interest in it. It would turn green and I'd know it was evening. I'd make another effort to divert my thoughts. I'd listen to my heart. I couldn't imagine that this noise, which had been with me for so long, could ever stop. I've never really had much imagination, and yet I tried to envisage a particular moment when the beating of my heart would no longer be going on inside my head, but in vain. Either the dawn or my appeal would still be there, and I'd end up telling myself that the most rational thing was not to hold myself back. So, and I'm reading, and lying there in my prison when the sky turned red and a new day slid into my cell, because I could just as easily have heard footsteps and my heart could have burst. So he was condemned to be killed, to be shot in the prison or whatever. So he writes that he knew that they came at dawn. So they came at dawn, I knew that. In fact, I spent every night just waiting for the dawn to come. I'd never liked being surprised. When something's happening to me, I'd rather be around. That's why I ended up only sleeping for a bit during the day, while all through the night I waited patiently for the dawn to break above the skylight. The most difficult part was that in-between time when I knew that they usually operated. Once it was past midnight, I'd be waiting, listening. Never before had my ears picked up so many noises or detected such tiny sounds, I must say. Also, thoughts of his being pardoned comes to his mind, and I'm reading, I'd so to speak give myself permissions to consider the alternative hypothesis. I was pardoned. The annoying thing was that somehow I'd have to control that burning rush of blood which would make my eyes smart and my whole body delirious with joy. I'd have to do my best to restrain this outburst, to be rational about it. I'd have to remain calm even about this hypothesis in order to make my resignation to the first one more plausible. So you see, imagine a person who's convicted for a murder and knows that he's going to die. He's in the death cell, sort of. So many things cross his mind. And then he refuses to see the chaplain, and I read that yet again, and I refuse yet again to see the chaplain. I was lying down. I could tell from a slight glow in the summer sky that evening was approaching. I just dismissed my appeal, and I could feel the regular pulse of my blood circulating inside me. I had no need to see the chaplain. For the first time in ages, I thought of his girlfriend, that is Mary. She hadn't written to me for days on end. That evening I thought it over and told myself that she'd probably got tired of being a condemned man's mistress. It also crossed my mind that she might have been ill or dead. It was in the natural order of things, and how would I have known when, now that we were physically separated, there was nothing left to keep it together and to remind us of each other anyway. From that point on, Marie's memory would have meant nothing to me. I wasn't interested in her anymore if she was dead. I found that quite normal, just as I could quite well understand that people would forget about me once I was dead. They had nothing more to do with me. I couldn't even say that this was hard to accept. It was at that precise moment that the chaplain walked in. A slight shiver went through me when I saw him. He noticed it and told me not to be afraid. I replied that he usually came at a different time. He told me that it was just a friendly visit and nothing to do with my appeal, which he knew nothing about. He sat down on my bunk and invited me to sit next to him. I refused. All the same, I found him quite pleasant. So he spoke to me, addressing me as my friend. It wasn't because I was condemned to death that he was talking to me like that. In his opinion, we were all condemned to death. But I interrupted him by saying that it wasn't the same thing and that anyway this could never be any consolation. Admittedly, he agreed, but if you don't die now, you'll die later, and the same problem will arise. How are you going to face up to that terrifying ordeal? I replied that I'd face up to it exactly as I was facing it up to now. He stood up, and when I said that and looked me straight in the eye, it was a game I knew well. I often used to play it with Ed Emmanuel, and they would look away. The chaplain knew the game well too. I could tell immediately. His gaze never faltered. His voice didn't falter either, and he said, "Have you really no hope at all, and do you live in the belief that you are to die outright?" "Yes," I said. Then he lowered his head and sat down again. He told me that he pitied me. He thought it was more than a man could bear. All I knew was that he was beginning to annoy me. I turned away as well and went and stood under the skylight. According to him, human justice was nothing and divine justice was everything. I pointed out that it was the former that had condemned me. He replied that it hadn't washed away my sin for all that. I told him I didn't know what a sin was. I'd simply been told that I was guilty. I was guilty and I was paying for it, and there was nothing more that could be asked of me. At that point, he stood up again, and I realized that in such a narrow cell, if he wanted to move, he didn't have much choice. He'd either have to stand up or sit down. The priest looked all around and replied in a voice which suddenly sounded extremely weary, "I know how the suffering oozes from these stones. I've never looked at them without a feeling of anguish. But deep in my heart, I know that even the most wretched among you have looked at them and seen a divine face emerging from the darkness. It is that face which you're being asked to see." I woke up a bit. I told him that I'd been looking at these walls for months. Maybe a long time ago I had looked for a face in them, but that face was the color of the sun and burning with desire. The chaplain looked at me almost sadly. By now I had my back right up against the wall and my forehead was bathed in light. He said a few words which I didn't hear and then asked me very quickly if I'd let him kiss me. No, I said. He turned and walked over to the wall and ran his hand slowly across it. Do you really love the earth as much as that? He murmured. I didn't answer. And I go on continuing reading that I was about to tell him to go away and leave me alone when suddenly he had a sort of outburst and turned towards me exclaiming, "No, I can't believe you. You must have surely at some time have wished for another life." I replied that naturally I had, but that it meant nothing more than wishing I was rich, nothing more than wishing I was rich or could swim fast or had a better shaped mouth. It was the same kind of thing, but he stopped me because he wanted to know how I imagined the other life. So I shouted at him, one which would remind me of this life. And in the same breath I told him that I had had enough. He'd started talking to me about God again, but I went up to him and made one last attempt to explain to him that I didn't have much time left. I didn't want to waste it on God. He tried to change the subject by asking me why I wasn't calling him father. That irritated me, and I told him that he wasn't my father. He was on the same side as the others. "No, my son," he said, placing his hand on my shoulder. And he said, "But you can't see that because your heart is blind." "I'm on your side," he said, "but you can't see that because your heart is blind. I shall pray for you." Then, for some reason, something exploded inside me. I started shouting at the top of my voice and I insulted him and told him not to pray for me. I grabbed him by the collar of his cassock. I was pouring everything out at him from the bottom of my heart in a paroxysm of joy and anger. He seemed so certain of everything, didn't he? And yet none of his certainties were worth one hair of a woman's head. He couldn't even be sure he was alive because he was living like a dead man. I might seem to be an empty-handed, but I was sure of myself, sure of everything, surer than he was, sure of my life and sure of the death that was coming to me. Yes, that was all I had, but at least it was a truth which I'd hold of just as it had hold of me. I'd been right, I was still right, I was always right. I'd lived in a certain way and I could just as well have lived in a different way. I'd done this and I hadn't done that. I hadn't done one thing, whereas I had done another. So what? So you can see, I mean, it's really, it's like Albert Camus to write so well. It flows. Really, it's such a engrossing book. It's a small little, it doesn't have many pages, but believe me, you will finish it at one go. So happy reading.